Actually, I'd be off the record. So he'll start, and then I'll say a few words, and then each of the panelists will speak for about 3 minutes, or take the word "about" out for 3 minutes. Q&A. So that's why we want to adhere to our schedule, so that some time for some back and forth. So Senator Brown, as soon as Sherrod's here, we'll pitch in, okay? You have the bios, so we won't spend time going through that. Each of them has a very distinguished background, relevant. So while we wait, if you just take a look at that, so you'll have the background. Thanks.
Yeah, I do. I'm okay with that on the record. So, Cindy, thanks. Thank you. I apologize making a number of you wait, or all of you waiting. So. Thanks, Sandy. Thanks for the work that you're doing on this. I wanted to start by we wanted to assemble a group of folks who make stuff up. That was a joke. You may have heard a certain support of this trade agreement talking about it, and they're making things up. So we put a group of people together who understand trade as deeply as anybody in this country, that they are raising about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The caliber of experts today, I think, is second to none in terms of understanding a number of these issues. We've selected people, and they've come forward to talk about a number of components about which people have raised questions. Sandy Levin has been a leader for long before I was. I came to Congress in '93 and worked with Sandy on that. It's important to slow this down and to really understand and to see before we vote on fast track. 9 of the 29 chapters are negotiated. Most of the other 20 are almost completed. So the president's and Ambassador Froman's contention that it's secret and nobody can see it because it would affect negotiations, those arguments are. We also know that some 50 corporate law executives have been part of this, these advisory groups that as to the negotiators and to some of the language, and perhaps put their imprimatur on some of the language, some of the text of the agreement. So we want to make sure that the public gets access to this too. 13 years ago, the last time this was done, we spent 3 weeks debating this. We should have the same time debate it today and in the next. Also think it's essential to do what we did in an omnibus package of an authority called Fast Track, technically then I think, but also had for workers, also had enforcement language in it. The fact that the more Americans hear about trade, the less they like it. Trent Lott once said you can't pass a trade agreement in an even-numbered year because the public paid too much attention. It was too close to the public doesn't like these trade agreements. I think that we should consider as people are pushing so hard with this. Let me go over the 4 biggest problems with Trade Promotion Authority with TPP and tie that in with TPA, then turn it over to Sandy, and I won't talk very much. I often there's a fast track in these trade agreements and make clear, Sandy up here wants more trade. We want more trade. under very different definitions and very different rules. But I often hear supporters saying, look how our exports are increasing. I'm a baseball fan, and when I hear somebody say, the Cleveland Indians scored 6 runs today, I think, that's good, but then I hear the Detroit Tigers scored 8. So when you talk about exports, that exports are going up, you need to look at imports too. And when you look at the Korea trade agreement, the promises from the administration that there would be $10 or $11 billion increase in exports and thousands of new jobs turned on its head when you look at the number of imports and what happened to the trade deficit during that. But 4 primary reasons that that it doesn't make sense. First of all, and offshoring of jobs. We know what happened with NAFTA. We know what PR, obviously not a trade agreement per se. We know what happened with CAFTA. The promises were made and more jobs. The exact opposite happened. Vietnam has a 29% per hour minimum wage. Malaysia has $1.22 an hour. In Vietnam, how do you get wages up? You get wages in part by having, Mr. Trumka, free trade unions. Vietnam has one trade union. It's called the Vietnam General Confederation of Labor. It's an arm of the they don't allow bargaining. To raise wages, you need a free bargaining process. Take Mexico. Its labor laws are already with ILO standards. Mexico's did very little to address the country's widespread violations of rights. One of the amendments that we will offer, if this bill, motion to proceed goes and this bill is on the floor, one of the motions we'll offer is that these countries, before being admitted in, that they have to show significant progress reaching the negotiating objectives that the president talks so much about. Instead, exports are up $1. Korean imports have gone $12 billion, hence the Indians and the Tiger score, although I said only 6 to 8. This is 1 to 12. A deficit with Korea has pretty quantifiably 5,000 lost jobs. Currency, we know what our trading partners have, how they've rigged the currency system to give exports an unfair price advantage, to give our businesses have trouble competing because of the subsidy. When we export, our businesses have trouble selling because of the penalty they pay. At least a $200 billion trade deficit increase, and nobody knows more about this than Fred Berkson, who will talk about this in a moment. There is my repeated questions to the USTR are rebuffed about China's admission into TPP. We have some concern that this president or a future president could backdoor China into the TPP without a vote of Congress. One of our amendments will be that simply put that no country can be admitted without a vote of Congress. The second largest economy in the world could come in. Congress is sort of. It makes you incredulous that could happen, but it could. Last is something that Lisa's been so good about, and that is the whole idea of corporate handouts and worker sellouts. When you look at investor-state dispute settlement, you can look at what happened in Australia, where their government passed 5 to 1 or 6 to 1, yet Morris could, using the National Trade Tribunal, set up shop in Hong Kong, sue the Australian government, mostly of trade lawyers, who have no connection to Australia except they're being paid to be trade lawyers and being paid to be on this tribunal, could actually overturn a democratically elected, democratically achieved rule, regulation, law from with no concurrence of people in that country. So we're particularly concerned about the fact that investors to go into a nation that's trying to pass a law and threaten a lawsuit, and we've seen this in the past where that nation simply backs off because they can't afford to go into court against the company. All are concerns. Now, I'll just close with this. We spent a lot of time in the last 2 years talking to the administration, suggest that would help in the developing world, would help richer countries, would help us in our country. Standards move in the right direction, could help build a middle class. The administration simply hasn't chosen. They want to do trade policy the way we've done it in the past. It clearly has. Look at our trade deficit when you look what's happened in states like Michigan and Ohio, but also in states like Oregon, and that it simply hasn't worked for our country. So I will turn it to Congressman Levin, who, as I said, been a role model to me and a leader in this issue for a couple of decades.
Thank you, Sherrod. In January, we laid out in a document to path forward, issues, and how we thought they should be addressed, talking about the CIO on virtually all issues. It's been the status quo, and there hasn't been forward movement. We laid a substitute that we tried to bring forth a few weeks ago. The Republicans ruled it out of order. So let me just sum up where matters are today on this vital issue. TPA is in trouble because TPP is on the wrong track on key issues. And if we vote fast track, essentially we're giving up leverage right. So Sherrod and I decided to bring forth a panel of experts to talk about these issues. And I just want to emphasize this, that having this discussion is the opposite of reflexive opposition. This is reflective discussion of, so each of them is going to speak about 3 minutes. Each of you has seen the order. We're going to start now with Dr. Simon Johnson from MIT.
Thank you very much, Congressman. My name is Simon Johnson. I'm a professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. The point I would like to make is the rule, and I think Senator Brown already said this, and Congressman Levin has said it. Just saying we're going to have more trade or we're going to have more exports doesn't tell me who won the baseball game or who's winning the baseball game or who is doing better and getting trade. Trade under the right rules is going to help your economy, and it's going to help generate jobs, and it's going to help generate higher incomes, including for people lower down the income distribution. Trade under the wrong rules is not going to be good for us, and it's not going to be good for most people in the countries we're trading with. So what in TPP? I don't know. I'm not allowed to read the text. That's what I've seen. The general outlines that have become public cause me concern. And I think that Congressman Levin, for example, has put forward some very sensible modifications, ways to address issues, and I think we're going to talk about more of the details in a moment. The idea that we would the issue or pass the trade promotional authority without first considering all of the details publicly, specific partnership, is a very bad idea. This is not the to do trade agreements. This is not the way to ensure that Americans benefit from trade agreements. Thank you.
You're next.
Lisa Johnson, Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. And I just wanted to highlight 4 issues that I see with investor-state arbitration. Investor-state arbitration, I think it's important to note, is really an while you hear frequently that there are 3,000 existing treaties, so that these are around for a while and nobody needs to be concerned, it's actually the case that the first one with investor-state arbitration, first investment treaty with investor-state arbitration, wasn't concluded in 1969, and the treaties weren't really concluded in earnest until the 1990s. The disputes really only started, again, to pile up in the 2000s. So this is really a new area of law, and I would view it as an experiment. And it's an experiment that many have cited as a failed experiment in a number of areas, that it hasn't led to increased investment flows. It has investors access to a set of predictable rights, and it also hasn't had any impact on the rule of law in host countries. So it's important to keep in mind when we're discussing the possibility of entrenching this experiment, and then not only entrenching it, but expanding it through the TPP and the TTIP. Currently, only a minimal amount of FDI in the U.S. is protected by investor-state arbitration. It would definitely Canada is the only state that's covered by investor-state arbitration. With TPP and TTIP, the amount of FDI under those 2 agreements in the U.S. that would be covered rises to 70%. So that shows you the expanse in potential exposure and to claims and liability it would face if it signed up to investor. A second point that I want to make is that ISDS, as I see it, risks undermining development, application, and enforcement of U.S. law. One thing that you'll commonly hear the USTR say about investment treaty standards is that they mirror standards in the US. And I would say that that's precisely the problem, that the standards that we have in the look very much like constitutional administrative law standards. But rather than, through ISDS, the investors going to domestic courts, they would have the opportunity to bring those administrative law type challenges, those constitutional type challenges to investor state arbitration, bypassing the courts and the domestic systems that are normally in charge and applying US law. A third point I would highlight is that if it is TPP, I'm not convinced that the fixes that have been called for by a number of people who are familiar with this area of law are included. I think there are a number of challenges and problems that still remain in the investment chapter as it is. And fourth, I would note that in the negotiating objectives, TPA look the same as they did in 2002. And based on the learning and the experience that we've gained over the last decade plus with investor state arbitration, it strikes me as very surprising and a missed opportunity to not shift the negotiating objectives and priorities for the investment chapter. All right, thank you.
Rich?
Thank you. I'm Rich Trumka, President of the AFL-CIO. Senator Brown, Congressman, for having us all here today, and thank you for being views and constituencies represented here. American workers need a raise, experiencing stagnating wages and increasing inequality for more than 2 decades. It doesn't have to be that way. The economy is not the weather. It's shaped by the deliberate policy choices, including choices about workers. We're hopeful that with a new administration, we'd have a chance to incorporate new trade and that would get new results. And now some claim that the TPP will bring us those new results. TPP's been called the most progressive agreement in our history, with the strongest labor and environmental provisions ever. Only the public and can't read. So what's the benchmark? To date, the United States has never had a trade agreement that effectively protected basic rights and raised and living standards. So comparing the TPP agreements sets a very low bar. American workers can compete with workers anywhere in the world if we have a level playing field. But seen, we don't believe that TPP will create that level playing field. Remember, a decade ago, we were told that CAFTA problems of NAFTA. But the AFL-CIO, together with several Central American unions, filed 2 petitions under CAFTA 12. Honduras have failed to meet the very standard of enforcing their own labor laws. In both cases, the U.S. government agreed that the petitions had merit, but 7 years later, a dispute settlement panel has yet to hear the Guatemala case, and it took the administration almost 3 years to publish a simple report on the Honduras case. Meanwhile, workers wait for justice. In May 2007, the administration and National Democrats represented a meaningful improvement for workers and the environment. Yet 8 years later, workers in Colombia still regularly face illegal firings, threats, intimidation, and assassinations. And Peru has rolled back laws. Huge disconnect under ways between enforceability and judicial enforcement. The GAO has criticized U.S. monitoring and enforcement of labor trade deals. And this administration has never self-initiated complaint any of our FTAs. And when we filed a petition, we've seen more delays than action. It's now 4 years since the implementation of the Colombian Labor Action Plan, and 105 unionists have been assassinated for union activities. It's not cause, if that's not cause for a, I don't know what is. And again, workers wait for justice. We're told assassinating trade unionists and violence against them does not violate the FTAs. So TPA TPP supporters have admitted that now hurt workers. And they asked us to believe that this time it's different. It seems to us that the burden of proof is on the supporters of these ideas to demonstrate what's different. Deals. Us is no longer convincing. And here's what we have to know what's good for workers. This ain't it. This time, please, trust us to know what's good for workers. And then there's Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia. All TPP countries are notorious human rights violators, currently out of compliance with the standards in the TPP, and known plan to withhold TPP benefits until those countries comply. This tells us all we need to know. So to create real change in trade policy, workers are counting on Congress to use its leverage to make sure that the promises made about the TPP are real, not illusionary. The way to do that, in our view, is to reject fast track, to hold up the text to the public, to open it up, and to work on changes, not just in the labor chapter, but across the NQ again.
Thank you. Fred, it's your shot.
I'm Fred Bergston, the founding director of the Institute for International Economics. I support both TPA and TPP because I think on balance they will be good for the country and good for the economy. But like any trade agreement, they will have, it's particularly critical that a parallel bill be passed to deal with trade adjustment assistance, as Brown said. That helps deal with the downside effects on American workers. It's an absolutely essential part of the deal. But there are other essential parts as well to the trade package. And the most important in economic terms is currency aid. Inflation has been by far the biggest government intervention in international markets. It's been by far the most unfair trade practice. For the last decade, about 20 countries have been intervening in the currency to the tune of about $1 trillion per year to keep currencies weak and to keep our currency overly strong. That means they have competitively devalued their currencies, and as Senator Brown said, given themselves a hugely unfair price advantage in. At its peak, when the Chinese were intervening to the tune of about $2 billion per day a few years ago, their currency was undervalued by 30%. That means they were subsidizing all exports by 30 to 40%, this trade balance by several hundred dollars per year, and cost the U.S. several million jobs right during the trough of the Great Recession, when we could leave till the horse was gone. The intervention and manipulation has declined over the last couple of years, but we know it'll come back. We know it's been huge. We know it'll be huge again. So several things should be done. It would be desirable to include a currency chapter in the TPP itself. But even doing that would miss some of the big culprits. China's not in the TPP. Korea, which has been the target of the latest Treasury reports, is not in the TPP, certainly at this point. So you need parallel action in addition to anything you did through the TPP. One set of actions are included in the amendments to the bill that comes out of the Senate Finance. They would provide substantial additional authorities to the Treasury. They would put a great deal of pressure on the Treasury to do more with manipulation. They would give new authorities to reject a country's future U.S. FTA if it were found guilty of currency manipulation. A very important deterrent and one of the kind of things we need. A second step, also in parallel legislation, the customs bill, would be the application of countervailing duties exports to the U.S. manipulated through currency intervention and thereby subsidized. That legislation, I think, should also be passed as part of this package. And then, best of all, would be my favorite, what I call countervailing currency intervention. If the Koreans buy $1 billion of dollars to keep the dollar over and their currency too weak, we should buy $1 billion of their currency. Just offset it. Tit for tat, fight fire with fire. We could do that with budget cost. In fact, we'd make money because we'd be buying undervalued currencies. There's no prohibition on such practices. The Exchange Stabilization Fund and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve have intervened countless times in the past and could do it again. And that would be, to me, the most effective overall device. It would deal with all trade, all countries, and would put the capstone on responding effectively to the distortion that one way or another has to deal with in the current context.
Thank you. Steve?
Congressman Levin, Senator Brown, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. My name is Steve Began, and I'm with Ford Motor Company. First, a word about Ford. Ford is one of the world's largest global manufacturers of automobiles, and its trade is absolutely fundamental. On an annual basis, we manufacture vehicles. We import millions, export millions to markets around the world. We have some experience in trade. I'd hope to think that we have some experience in the issues that we're confronting with some of our TPP members. It's a little-known fact to most people that the auto sector is the #1 sector of exports from the United States economy. Ford Motor Company is the top exporter of automobiles from the United States. But when it comes to Japan, we will sell more vehicles. U.S. manufacturers will sell more by the end of today than we'll sell in an entire year in Japan. Why is that? Japan is the first automobile market in the world, and yet is the closed auto market to importers. Now think about this. In an average year, 93% of the vehicles sold in Japan are made in Japan by Japanese manufacturers. In fact, not a single non-Japanese manufacturer is in Japan today. All of this despite the fact that since 1979, Japan doesn't even charge a tariff on automobile imports. So we were eager to see the Trans-Pacific Partnership try to take the issues founding automobile manufacturers from gaining access to the Japanese market. And to their credit, our U.S. negotiators have tried dutifully to address some of these issues. There are a number of technical barriers to trade and discriminatory taxes that have been used over the years to keep the Japanese market closed. Regulatory issues like radio frequencies, daytime running lamps, exterior occupant protection rules, high-pressure gas safety regulations affecting some of the safety measures in the car. All these are important issues. To their credit, USTR is taking them on. But USTR is spending 99% of its time on 1% of the problem. Non-tariff barriers when there's a flow of trade. And there is simply no flow of trade between the United States and Japan in automobiles. And why is this? Well, I think Fred Bergston just laid it out in very good detail. Currency is the mother of all trade barriers. If we could get improved access, which is the 4th largest automobile market in the world, if we're going to be manipulators of their currency. Dr. Art Laffer from the Laffer Institute recently published a study looking at the history of currency manipulation in Japan and found that over 2 decades, from 1991 to 2011, the Japanese central bank has intervened 376 times. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me 376 times, I think you know how that one ends. Japan's interventions, incidentally, were all in violation of commitments in the IMF and the WTO. And this is why Ford strongly supports the amendment that will be offered in the Senate by Senator Portman and Senator Brown, who are seeking disciplines into trade authority. Addressing this issue is critically important to Ford Motor Company's 80,000 American employees. We can compete with the Central Bank of Japan. In currency manipulation rules authority and TPP to be pushed over the top, winning the support of a broader bipartisan coalition and the support of the American people. The American people are ahead of Washington on this issue. They're ahead of policymakers and the Obama administration when it comes to manipulation, because they know that they suffer when other countries cheat at trade. It is long since past when America can afford to ignore. The bottom line is this. We need currency rules for trade, and we shouldn't let free trade be an obstacle to a free trade agreement. Thank you.
I'm Stephanie Burgos with Oxfam America. Oxfam is a global organization working to right the wrongs of poverty and injustice. We believe trade can be an engine for benefit. Trade agreements are about rules, as Simon Johnson just said. And in the case of TPP, the rules on intellectual property and pharmaceutical pricing, which affect access to medicines, are written to benefit interests over the public interests. The TPP text by the administration is unacceptable from a public health and development perspective because it would undermine access to affordable medicine. The rules significantly expand monopoly power and restrict generic competition and thus keep prices high. Enabling generic competition is the only proven means of reducing medicine prices in a sustainable way. In the US, 86 products, saving $1.5 trillion in healthcare costs in the past decade. In developing countries, fewer public resources for healthcare and limited insurance coverage mean people have to pay for medicines out of pocket. Higher medicines costs mean increased suffering, loss of livelihood, and even loss of life, particularly for those at the lower end of the economic spectrum. The administration says we should just that the TPP would cause no harm to public health. Since the devil is in the details and the details are secret, such false assertions are getting airplay. But there are two things that we at Oxfam can say for certain from what we know about the TPP. First, the TPP would do more harm. The TPP would do more to undermine affordable medicine than any previous U.S. trade. Second, the intellectual property provisions in TPP agreement reached between congressional leaders and the Bush administration in 2007 and a step backward for public health. Recognize the need for balance between monopoly protection and access, the use of public health safeguards, and place limits on the most harmful intellectual property included at that time in U.S. free trade agreements. But TPP provisions go far beyond any measures negotiated in free trade agreements back in 2007, granting more extensive monopoly power to originator companies. Scope and duration of patents far beyond the year protection period. This restricts generic competition, medicine prices high, even no better outcome for patients. TPP also introduces new protections for bilateral action by Congress or the administration to bring down the exorbitant prices of some of these medicines. Just last week, the World Health Organization revised its essential medicines list, adding 36 new medicines, including biologics, and underscored, and I quote, the urgent need to take action to promote equitable access to several new, highly effective medicines, some of which are currently even for high-income countries, unquote. Yet the TPP would limit its ability to expand access to these treatments due to the high cost of public health budgets and patients. To give an example, a recent academic study on the potential impact of TPP provisions on HIV medicines in Vietnam found that with the country's HIV patients now in treatment would have access to those essential medicines. The bottom line is that the TPP's intellectual property provisions will undermine public health and access to affordable medicines. They are incoherent and inconsistent with U.S. global health policy. They are broadly opposed by negotiating countries and have no place in the TPP future U.S. trade agreements. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. My name is Ilana Solomon, and I direct the Sierra Responsible Trade Program. First, want to offer my thanks to Congressman Levin and Senator Brown for inviting the Sierra Club to join the discussion, and more importantly, for your leadership on ensuring trade is done right. The Sierra Club has been working on making sure trade is responsible and sustainable for over 2 decades, and we're here today because based on the history of free trade agreements and based on evidence that's packed with our water and our climate. Let's start with the TPP Environment chapter. First, while the chapter will touch on a broad range of issues, including shark finning or trade, the obligations themselves, what countries are actually required to do, are often very weak. For example, rather than prohibiting commercial whaling and shark fin trade, both major issues in TPP countries, the TPP is likely to include vague language around the protection of marine mammals that may sound nice, but stops far short of requiring countries to stop these harmful practices. We are concerned that the TPP will not require countries to prohibit trade in illegally taken timber and wild chapter or the entire pact. Second, we are concerned that whatever language is agreed to in the Environment chapter will not be enforced, despite documented evidence that some countries, like Peru, are not living up to their environmental obligations in free trade with the United States, the U.S. Trade Representative, and at the same time, any potential benefit of the Environment chapter would be by other negative impacts of the pact. The TPP vastly expands the investor-state dispute settlement system that corporations are increasingly using, challenging climate and clean energy policies, moratorium on fracking in Quebec to a nuclear energy phase-out in Germany, or lock-in rules that would harm our air, water, in which it has never been more critical for Congress to maintain its leverage in the negotiations. And the bill contains guidelines for the USTR to have ostensibly the contents of the pact that are completely unenforceable and completely irrelevant. So for these reasons, the Sierra Club strongly opposes the Hatch-Wyden-Ryan bill, and we urge members of Congress to join us in opposition. Thank you.
Well, we'll now take some questions and answers. Sherrod, Senator Brown has to leave soon. I just hope all of you have had a chance to digest the substance. The keynote here is when it comes to expanded trade, substance matters. I favor expanded trade in the right way, shaping it appropriately. This is all about. Okay, Senator Brown has about 8 or 9 minutes.
And questions can be directed, obviously. to
Robert, you have the mic, so, and just try to on the various places at equal chance, not just those in the front row. That's an old. Go ahead.
Hi, Athena Jones from CNN. Several of you brought up currency manipulation and a lot of problems from previous free trade agreements. We just left an event with Senator Carper, who is, of course, supporting Fast Track. He said that the IMF in the next couple of months is set to sign off saying that China is manipulating its currency. Just have any that. Also said that people don't realize that many of the issues people had with are somehow fixed in this current agreement. How do you respond to that?
Briefly.
As I said in my remarks, the amount has declined a lot. Trade surplus has come way down, its currency has come way up, and in fact, its currency is now under some downward pressure in the markets, and they've been intervening to limit the decline of their currency. So the comment is correct. On the other hand, the Treasury has just put out its own latest report indicating that in their judgment, the Chinese currency is still substantially undervalued. The analysis at my Peterson Institute supports that. I think the IMF view is based on one of its 2 or 3 different definitions, and as said before, you can read it different ways. So my view is down a lot. They're still undervalued. They may go back to their bad old ways, and the issue is to deter future practices of that type, suffer huge costs as we did over the last decade.
I sat in the auditorium in the spring of 2008 at Cleveland State University hearing the 2 Democratic candidates for president debate. The moderator asked them a question about NAFTA. Would you renegotiate? Senator Obama said yes, he would renegotiate NAFTA. There is no sign in this the problems with NAFTA have been fixed. If you want a closer to the present example, look at the promises made on Korea, where there were promises and higher wages. We've seen the exact opposite of Korea. So these trade agreements, as Rich Trumka said, the promises are always about higher wages. The promises are always about increased evidence, and the result have never been that, have never even close up to the promises.
So let me just briefly address the second question, because the administration likes to say this will be the most progressive trade agreement. The May 10th language that's in the House put together was a major forward in terms of labor, environment, and medicines. The present agreement incorporates the language, but the test rule we changed their laws before we voted on it. The problem you have is now as mentioned here, Vietnam, one union tied into the government and allows no independent organization formed by workers. And Mexico has a pattern that is also in violation of basic ILO standards. So say that TPP, as negotiated, is essentially implementing the language of May 10th, is not at all clear, in part because, well, the administration says they're negotiating. At this point, they're not known. In that sense, at this point, they're secret if they exist. Next question.
Gregory Roberts. This would be a little more understandable if you were battling the Scott Walker administration over this issue. Democratic administration. Are you suggesting that administration is or they don't understand, or what do you think is going on here? Why are you guys in conflict with them?
I guess you'll have to ask the administration that. I don't question motives. I don't question their beliefs. I question where they've come out on this. 80 to 85% of Democrats in the House have planned so that they lift standards to a place that I think Democrats and I think the country as a whole strongly believe in. One of the where I think has erred in his judgment is putting emphasis on negotiating when without any of those negotiating objectives, with any kind of mandatory aspect to them. They're almost like, well, here are the negotiating objectives, Mr. Trade Representative, go on objectives. So the president can brag about environmental standards. Ilana can brag about labor, food safety, and all the things that 90% of Americans. Those negotiating objectives simply aren't enforceable when you have a trade representative's office. They don't seem to change much over the years. The world, a trade representative's office that won't on environment, on labor standards, on food safety, on.
So quickly, most start from the assumption that more trade is regardless. Cite Ricardo. Changed since then. And I think among Democrats there's a recognition we believe in expanded in terms of right here and now. Dave Camp had negotiating objectives that essentially are so vague they're window dressing. There's nothing specific about them. And TPA accepted that language in every case. 80, 90 pages are exactly the same today as they were ago. And we filed in the House a bill that would have specific instructions, and whether those were met would be not judged by the people who were negotiators. And I want to finish with opinion. I think for those who agree, we're respectful of the president and the administration, but we think on many issues, they simply don't have it right yet. And we're emphatic about not giving up our leverage until those issues are right. Where's the mic? Come on.
Hi, Carter Doherty with Bloomberg. A question for Senator Brown. Senator Brown, Elizabeth Warren raised the prospect of some Dodd-Frank rules being rolled back through trade agreements. Given your experience, I mean, Treasury doesn't like trade negotiators. Reason do we have to believe that Treasury Treasury would enjoy trade negotiators playing in their financial regulation sandbox? I mean, this is something the Treasury has opposed for years under Democratic and Republican administrations. I'm also going to, as a segue into asking what you think of the 200 pages of Shelby has proposed to Dodd-Frank, whether this is any sort of basis for beginning work.
Okay, I'll take the second one briefly first, and I apologize for having to leave. We have a 2:30 vote on fast track today on holding all four of them together. Senator McConnell has put only two of them in the package. TAA and TPA, the last thing we should do is send a bill to the president's desk that falls short, as Fred said, falls short on ultimately helping workers, and that's why Democrats today, and Republicans, although I don't know, will under three, and let's debate it. I am totally open, as all Democrats are in the banking community, for reforms for community banks and credit unions, $1 billion. We're not in major reforms, major changes in the Federal Reserve that haven't really been discussed. And we're not at all interested in rollbacks of Dodd-Frank affecting FSOC, where we would see all kinds of potential abuses. I think my colleagues sometimes on the banking committee forget that we went through the most difficult time economically in this country since World War II, 2007, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And I think this action doesn't play well there. The question, I am more. I agree with Senator Warren that there's all kinds of opportunities for large corporate interests, those companies that have sort of led the charge in outsourcing, and other companies. Investor state, as Lisa said, to use investor state to roll back democratically attained rules and regulations and laws around. My biggest concern is public health. Just the threat of tobacco companies doing Africa and Latin America to countries to roll back all of us that had anything to do in this agreement. And I worry about I worry about the influence that companies and oil companies and other large that have had far too much power with this administration. I worry about the influence they've had on this agreement, the 400 corporate leaders that have been in the room and executives, and the that they've put on this bill, and this Trans-Pacific and the influence that they will continue to have.
What Senator Warren was saying, I don't think I understood. This is likely a 6-year PA if it passes. That's what she was saying. And if there were another Republican president, Republican Congress, there could be an effort through TPP, another, to essentially amend and the Europeans have been asking that that kind of issue be addressed. All right, I think maybe since Senator Brown had to leave, maybe we'll wrap it up. Is that okay? Thank you very, very much for coming. This has been very productive.